When we think of Norse myths in books today, popular 20th century writers like Neil Gaiman and Kevin Crossley-Holland, Joanne Harris and Rick Riordan, Louie Stowell and many more, and even the colourful world of Marvel Comics, immediately come to mind. They are the giants of modern Norse retelling. But what if I told you there's a forgotten foundation of Norse myth storytelling that predates them all? The names of these authors, all of them women, have completely vanished from the record. Discover a group of women writers from the 19th century who were retelling the sagas and reimagining the North. Their books achieved massive popularity in their time. Some are now even considered classics. So why are they forgotten? Why are they still unrecognised by readers of the 20th century, in an era when Norse mythology is reaching new heights of fame in popular culture? Today we're going on a literary journey to uncover these lost storytellers and their legacy perhaps. And joining me to piece together this historical puzzle and put these forgotten voices back on the map is Dr. Kevin Filan. Welcome to the Valhalla Conversations podcast, Dr. Kevin.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's absolutely lovely to be here.
Now, I've mentioned this in previous episodes with previous guests, but I have a strong connection with Stavanger. I keep name dropping every chance I can. And this is where you and me first met at the lovely Mari Symposium, and we both shared and raved about Norse stuff for a whole glorious 3 or 4 days. Gosh, seems like a lifetime ago now. And it's also the place where I picked up, when I can bring it into view, this beautiful, beautiful book, if only because it's got a beautiful cover. Tales of Norse Mythology, written not by Neil Gaiman, not by Kevin Crossley-Holland, but by a lady called Helen Guber. Or Gerber, I can never get right. I keep going goo, too hard on the goo. Now that's the first time I've come across a kind of like a 19th century woman author retelling Norse myths or even retelling sagas. But I'm interested to hear how you came across these women, because you were the one who first told me about them.
That's right. Yeah, well, my research, which I recently just completed, was mainly about Marvel movies, so the use of the Norse myths in the Marvel cinematic universe. But that took me back looking at the comics, and after I'd sort of looked at the comics, I tried to work out what were the books that may have inspired, the original comics when Jack Kirby and Stan Lee were working on them. So I went down this awful rabbit hole of trying to find out what conceivably were these books that they'd looked at, and it was impossible. I completely drew a blank. So if anyone can actually find out for sure what those were, I'd be extremely interested in hearing about it if anyone listening to this knows. But what I did find was this big tranche of retelling starting in the mid 19th century, which, yeah, I wouldn't say have been completely forgotten. You can find out one or two things about them, but yes, are very rarely discussed by scholars, and I would say, yeah, most of them by women. There are a couple of men got involved as well, but mostly female writers, and rightly, as you say, mostly pretty much forgotten.
So was it Helen Gerber perhaps that you first came across as a name, or were there other names that you discovered?
Well, she was one of the first that I found. Yeah, I've got a copy of I think it's one of the earlier editions of that. It's quite a well-known book. This originally 1895. I'm not sure which edition that I've got here, but yeah, pretty early one. And that's been in print basically ever since. She's an American writer. You can find out almost nothing about her. You can look online, and considering, I think, heaven only knows how many copies that book has sold. And she also wrote many other books about sort of popular mythology and history. I would comfortably say she must have sold, there must be 1 million copies of books by her having been sold in the decades since, but she wasn't quite the first, no. So when I sort of got tracing backwards, I found this book, which again is not completely forgotten. I'm not sure if you can see that, but The Heroes of Asgard and the Giants of Jotunheim, it was called in its very, very first version, by two sisters originally from Yorkshire.
Wow.
Annie, yes, that's right, Annie and Lisa Keary. And they wrote their first edition in 1857, and they, I think, are the real kind of unsung heroes of keeping the myths alive, or really gaining quite a bit of the popularity that they have, because they pretty much realized that you could tell these tales in a way that would appeal to children to start with, but also you could actually turn them into these, kind of discrete stories. Because if you go back and look at the Poetic Edda, and particularly the Prose Edda, it does take quite an imaginative leap, I think, to go from reading those and saying, there's a collection of tales here. That's an enormous leap from those Eddas to, say, Neil Gaiman, who you mentioned at the start. And really, these writers were the missing link in all this, and the Kearys especially, I think. So yeah, that first edition came out in 1857. It didn't do all that well, from what I can tell. It's very, very hard to find copies of that edition, and part of the reason, I think, is it's told in quite a weird style. So it's arranged, the story of a group of children who find themselves together at the family house over the Christmas holidays. And one of them has seen a copy of Northern Antiquities, and asks basically if the adults can tell them stories about these strange old Northern peoples or whatever. And so it's structured like that. So it's structured with some dialogue at the start between the adults and the children, and then they tell a few of the stories. And then at the end of each chapter, there's a bit of a discussion as well. So it's all rather it rather feels like a sort of a school book in some ways, and I can sort of see why perhaps it didn't do tremendously well. But I uncovered then some correspondence between the Keary sisters and the Macmillan Publishing House, and it was someone at the Macmillan Publishing House who had the inspired idea of that within this sort of collection, this slightly strangely structured collection, was a more straightforward book. And so Annie went off, re-edited the entire thing, got rid of the dialogues, wrote a kind of semi-scholarly introduction around it, and the second edition, which came out in 1870, is a more kind of orthodox, a more straightforward book of retellings. So you'll find you can pick that up, get through the introduction, and you will basically find most of the myths, or a lot of the myths, there in a way which is quite, you would find very, familiar, having read books like Kevin Crossley-Holland and Neil Gaiman. So I would say, yeah, that was a groundbreaking bit of pioneering work from those two sisters. But I'll tell you something that struck me. How much credit do you think they got for this imaginative leap, this pioneering work? And if you remember, they were women, and they were kind of, avowedly middle class and not terribly well connected to the fashionable world. And their father was a cleric, actually, originally from Ireland. So bearing all that in mind, if you'd have guessed that they got basically no credit, then you'd be right. You'd be absolutely spot on, because they, like as you said at the start, they're very rarely talked about now, and they weren't sort of too much talked about then either. Their book was referenced by quite a few people, but they weren't named very often. I think Rudyard Kipling mentions the book in Puck of Pook's Hill, which is great that he mentions it, but no mention of the actual authors. And one thing that struck me as being really quite indicative of all this is Macmillan, which obviously still an enormous publishing house.
Yeah.
I think it was in 2024 came out with a big sort of very, very lavish book of retellings called the Macmillan Book of the Norse Myths, or similar. And you can, and it's got a foreword by Michael Mapugo, the children's author, the very, very well regarded. So his name is on the cover, but the Keary's names are not on the cover at all. There's actually the only reference to the authors, and it's still their text. It's still 99% just the book that they wrote, that's buried on something like page 270 or something like that. You get one page about these authors, and it's just a little bit sad, really. I feel a bit bad for them. But yeah, like I said, I think that was a great piece of imagination to realize that there was a book of children's stories in here, and lots and lots of authors have been kind of copying the work that they did ever since.
That is fascinating. I didn't know about those two, because I have got two other books as well as Helen Gerber's one, because I recently made the trip to York to see their Viking North exhibition, and of course went through the gift shop, because you have to go to the gift shop to get anywhere in that museum. And I saw all these pretty covers, and one of the books Oh gosh, let me just check which one it is. Let me bring it in front of my face. This shiny, shiny, shiny one.
Hmm.
It's it's a collection of multiple female authors. So
Right.
it's got Abby Farewell Browning, Sarah Powers Bradish, Mary Litchfield, and others. If I'm just looking through the content, it's got Kellett as a surname. It's got Magnuson and Morris. Don't know who they are. It's got Goddard.
Oh yeah.
But it hasn't got the two sisters in at all. Um,
No, but that that's probably fair enough. There were
yeah.
lots of other authors, including many of those that you just mentioned, and some you can see the evidence of that they've read the Curie sisters. Not all of them. There are a couple of different sort of traditions going on. So some have taken different authors as their source material. So yeah, we could go. I could go on about this all day if you want. But this,
No,
but
we're quite happy. It's what we're here for.
no, well, so there's let me see if I can tell you. There's quite an interesting thing which struck me as I was reading many of these retellings. So I mentioned I've been down this rabbit hole looking at them, and I can never quite remember the number. I think it's 46 separate books of retellings were published in English in the United States or the UK between 1857 and 1962, which is the year when The Mighty Thor launched. So that's why I've kind of taken those as my cutoff point. And I've read all of them. And there is a really curious thing. So let me see if I can explain this in the simplest way. So in the story, the very, very famous story of when Thor goes to Utgarda-Loki, the court of Utgarda-Loki, and he's tested. All his companions, Loki and Thjalfi as well, are tested, and Thor fails the test. He can't drain the drinking horn, he can't win a wrestling match, etc., etc. On the way, they meet the giant Skrimir, and they pool their resources together in a bag, and this bag, the word that Snorri Sturluson uses in the Prose Edda is the Old Norse word is nestbagi. Okay, and you can go and look that up in the dictionary, and it will tell you something like that. It means a bag of provisions. So very straightforwardly, exactly what you would do. You would put your sandwiches in, or you would put when you were going off on a trip. And what happened was, when this story first was made really available in English, really for the first time, I think was in a book, yes, the book I mentioned earlier on, Northern Antiquities, which was put together by Bishop Percy, based on the work of a Swiss, what would you call him, kind of historian or antiquarian called Mallet. Anyway, so when he told us, when in the French version or French language version by Mallet, the word he uses for this nest bag, this bag of provisions, is valise, which is common now. So we would think of that as a suitcase or a case of some kind, I think. But my knowledge of kind of French is not good enough to tell you what that would have meant in the 18th century. But anyway, when that was translated, the word that was used in Northern Antiquities was wallet. So very strange choice it sounds to us now, right? Why would you use the word wallet? You think about wallet, and obviously you think about something like this. But again, so I went back and had a look. I got hold of a copy of the OED, and I discovered that back then, wallet could mean a kind of a knapsack. So it was a reasonably it was a reasonable choice, I think, to have made in the 18th century. That was maintained when the book was updated in, I can never remember the Blackwell's revision of Northern Antiquities or something like 1847. That's terrible, absolutely hopeless on dates. So you'll just have to forgive me. Perhaps you could prop up on the screen all the dates I get wrong. You can prop them up or something like that. So again, they kept with the word wallet. So when the very, very first retailers were telling these stories, they chose the word wallet as well, because it had come from the source material. And like I say, maybe even in the 19th century, maybe even in the late 19th century, it was still a reasonable choice. Maybe I found at least one book at the time called The Tramp's Wallet, which suggests that it could still mean a bag of provisions. But what's really curious is that different retailers continue to choose this word, wallet, even well into the 20th century, when it really is starting to be a very strange choice of word. So what does that tell us? Obviously, that tells us that they were all just copying off each other, or many of them were just copying off each other, and they weren't going back to the source material, which, you know, most people just don't anyway. It's sort of human nature. But many who sort of claim to have gone back to the early sources, even some claiming that they went back and looked at the editors themselves, clearly didn't. Clearly, they were just taking their stories from other retailers. And so using that and certain other words, certain other situations in these stories, you can actually trace which retailers used which kind of resources. And this goes all the way up to the last one I found was another very, very famous retelling by Roger Lancelin Green. In 1960, he published the Saga of Asgard. That was a very, very influential book as well. So that was one of the books that Neil Gaiman read when he was a kid, along with the Kevin Crossley-Holland. Yeah. And he uses wallet. So I'm going to use this word. He fails what I call the wallet test. And so he's banged to rights basically as having taken that from someone, because I don't think in 1960 you could realistically use the word wallet to mean a bag of provisions. So anyway, you can look at that. You can look at certain other choices, and like I say, you can trace a sort of a line of transmission, certainly for some authors anyway. And this is what's been kind of interesting me for the last few months, as I've been sort of, once I decided to go down the rabbit hole, it really was kind of head first for me. And so I've been looking at all these retellings, all these wonderful retellings, and and trying to see what I can learn from them, from this exercise. And I'll highlight a couple more, if you don't mind me just
Please
banging
do.
on. So there's this one which I managed to find by an author called Alice Zimmern. This is she's called this Gods and Heroes of the North, which is a fairly straightforward. So I was very, very pleased to find this, published in 1907. But the book I really want is her sister previously wrote a book. I think it was again, I keep mentioning I'm hopeless on dates, but it was around about 1890s anyway, I think, Helen Zimmern. And I have never ever come across a copy of that book. I've got a PDF version of it, so I've read it. It's very good, and the illustrations in it look remarkable. But if anyone out there ever sees that book, there is not much I wouldn't do to get hold of a copy of that book. So you can always just get in contact with me if you happen to ever find one in a secondhand bookshop. There are some other really lovely editions. There's this one by Dorothy Belgrave and Hilda Hart.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Which is beautiful, yeah. And you can sort of see the quality of the illustrations by Harry G. Thieker. I'll give you a flavor. It's this kind of thing. And it really is.
I'll forgive them.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I know you've talked about that before. In some ways, I don't mind the horned helmets. Whatever floats your boat. I think it's good. Look at this. Look at this of Thiassi.
Oh, wow.
And abducting Idun. It's like it's I think it's actually wonderful stuff. Yeah, these are. Honestly, I've done a little bit of work just looking at basically just cataloging all these books really, and looking a little bit about the different ways that they retell the stories. But even just the illustrations themselves in this book would be a wonderful project for someone. You could really just look and see if you could get hold of all the original editions, then you would find out some interesting stuff. Going all the way back to the Kearys, is just remembered as well that the person who did the illustrations for that book in the 1857 version, and I would have to say they're not really very good illustrations in my, from what I can tell, but it was a chap called Charles Altamont Doyle, who is the the father of the Sherlock Holmes creator. So you get
Really?
yeah, Sir
Wow.
Arthur Conan, and so you get these funny, very funny little stories, these funny little facts that you learn as you go along. So, but yeah, a couple of very weird illustrations there. If you find an 1857 copy, which you can online, have a look at one that has the Ella women in there. It's quite it is sometimes still talked about. It's a very strange illustration. It's worth looking at. But yeah, wonderful books, lots and lots of wonderful illustrations, and I would encourage anyone who has a chance. I'll just show you one more, because again, I think it's really rather wonderfully illustrated as well. This book by Barbara Leone Picard. She's one of the authors who tells, the Eddic stories, so the stories of Thor and Odin and Loki, and then has half the book on kind of heroic stories as well. So it tells some of the saga stories and so on as well. So it's good if you like that mix. But this is about 1956. I'm actually going to double check that if I can see that. 1953. So I'm always wrong. The one thing you can rely on with me is if I give you a date, it'll be wrong to some
You're always
degree.
Close. You're not that far
Yeah,
off.
exactly. It doesn't really matter. I'm not being examined on this, thank God. But yes,
No.
this is again, this is a lovely, all the way through these absolutely gorgeous illustrations by Kittle Munro. Absolutely fabulous. And this is a fantastic retelling. This is really one of my favorites. I think she was a wonderful author. There's a review of her book by Roger Lancelyn Green, which I read, and he's quite dismissive of its quality, which tells you a fair bit as well, because it's much better than his book, which came out some years later. But he's really rather sniffy about the quality of her book, but it's wonderful. And I particularly, there's a wonderful portrait of the giantess goddess Skadi when she comes and looks for retribution, when she comes to look for payback in the home of the gods, and the way she is described is absolutely fantastic. She's described as this kind of avenging angel. She is a terrifying, absolutely dauntless, armed to the teeth woman who's come to get payback for what's happened. And it's a terrific portrait, and I think actually, and maybe even anticipates some later and much more lauded feminist rewriting maybe of fairy tales and things like this. I think she's an absolutely wonderful author. And interestingly, there's an author called Melvin Burgess who wrote a really good novel called Loki recently, and her book, that was the book that he read growing up as a kid. And so I think, so that's another one of these connections you often find. So you often see like later authors who will say which of these, this is the type of book that these authors came across when they were children, and obviously they first, including some of the authors that you've interviewed as well. I think it's this kind of book that they would have read, and this is how they would have been exposed to the myths, I think. So yeah, fantastic.
I can't believe I forgot about Melvin Burgess, because I remember reading his Blood Song and Blood Tide duology, which was his apocalyptic sci-fi retelling of the Volsung saga, which made me think that Odin's not that kind of a nice guy. And then I read the original saga, and I still thought Odin's still not kind of a nice guy. But yes, I have got his Loki book on my to read list. I don't think I've even bought it yet, but as you can tell, I have a kid and another kid on the way. I just have very little time for reading what I want to read. But I have a lovely hoard of books waiting for when the time arrives.
That's well worth diving into when you get a minute. Yeah, I think that's as you know, having read the other stuff, he's a very, very excellent writer, and I think that's great. Yeah.
Well, let me pick your brains then. Kind of like, you've looked at a lot of so many authors. I said like 40 odd in the span of just under a century, I'd say. Kind of like, was there a tendency for a lot of them to focus on the mythological, kind of like Snorri's retelling kind of aspect, or were some of them leaning more, as you say, to the heroic saga type stories? Because I know I've got another book, which is the one I did pick up when I went to York, which is this one, and apparently it's by Jenny Hall. But it's mostly about the tales and adventures of King Harold of Norway, I want to say.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's not really involving the gods much, but it's still got kind of that Viking element because it's a Viking king going off on raids and adventures, and it's got some nice illustrations in it. And I thought, that's actually interesting, because I don't always know kind of like what attracts people first, especially kind of like going that far back before popular culture and popular society and TV and films and comics. When books were the entertainment of the day, quite literally, kind of like how much the sagas or the mythology stories attracted an audience, because that was surely must have been what was driving the publishers to even agree to publish any of these books to begin with.
Yeah, I think, I mean, yeah, absolutely nail on the head. There was this tension, going on where you had publishers seeing for the first time maybe that there was not just a modest market for this kind of thing, but as the explosion of literacy happened, and by the 1890s, universal literacy, very close to it, maybe in I can't remember when the key education acts were, but around about that time. So you had this incredible market in both the United States and the UK by the end of that 19th century. And I think what people were seeing was you could do a translation of a saga maybe, and that would be very well received, and in the drawing rooms of genteel kind of Victorian or mid-century, let's say, England, would be very well admired and would sell a few copies. Or by the end of that century and the start of the 20th century, if you got the market right, then sales would be almost unlimited. And what we started to see was, with some of the books of retellings of the Eddic myths anyway, that they were being repackaged in versions for schools. And so who was it? Hamilton Wright, maybe one of the few men to be writing this type of thing. His book came out in a school's edition. Actually, the Keary's book came out in a school's edition, which sold in the US as well, I'm pretty sure. And I think the numbers of sales, it's almost impossible to track down. I'm pretty sure it is impossible. Would have been absolutely massive. So I think what you definitely had was whatever the authors wanted to write, I think the publishers, as always, knew what would sell. And like I say, I think the Eddic myths, the stories of Thor and Loki and so on, seemed very well attuned to this. Yes, you could do the saga stuff as well, and I would say of the 46, at least 15 include significant elements of heroic literature as well, usually in the second half of those books, usually at the end. But most of them were selling it on Thor and Odin and Loki. And I think what you had, even if this was never sort of said, I think what people realized pretty damn quick was that these were how you were going to sell the book, and you could pad it out with some other stuff, and maybe that was your best stuff as a writer, I don't know. But if you wanted your book to sell, then selling it on the basis of Thor and Odin and Loki and so on was a pretty good way of doing it. Now, that's not to say the other stuff wasn't being written, because it absolutely was. It sold really, really well. I'm not an expert on this by any means, but I've heard Andrew Warne was one of my old teachers at Leeds University back when I did my first degree many decades ago. Andrew Warne wrote that amazing book, The Vikings and the Victorians, which is this look at how the popularity of the Vikings and so on exploded during this time. And he's absolutely fantastic on everything, apart from maybe the retellings, apart from the Victorian retellings. I figure he just didn't really have time or space to get into it. There's a couple of references. He looks at a couple of books, but he was really more interested in these kind of Viking books. A lot of novels. Again, like I said, I'm not an expert at all. Someone else would be able to tell you, or you could look this up, of course. But yeah, tons and tons of Viking novels. Just vague, and I think the novelization of stories like that probably work quite well. You could make them probably have like nice lurid covers and have like very lots of blood and lots of Valkyries and lots of so on, telling these sort of Viking tales. And that was definitely a hugely important tradition as well, and very, very popular. But yes, in this particular one about these books, it does seem that you see a lot more focused on the epic stories than you do focused or trying to sell the book on the basis of the heroic stories.
Mm. Because certainly thinking back to my kind of like early 20th century education, Vikings came up at, I think, very briefly in primary school, but most predominantly when I did mid history. But I didn't do it as a GCSE, it was before my GCSE year. But that was more focused on kind of like the Alfred the Great reign versus the Vikings, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So we did touch on the mythology briefly in order to understand who the Vikings were. And I've never really considered whether how long the Vikings have always popped up on syllabuses going back decades, if not centuries. Because of course it's like a British pride thing of how many times they've been invaded and fought off this person, that person.
No, that's right. That's right. Yeah, and it's really funny. I was brought up in a Viking village, so not like a recreating, not where we all pretended to be Vikings, but in a place called Formby, in north of Liverpool, and yeah, and that's that town, that little village is very, very proud of its Viking heritage, and of course, lots of people. To this day, you know, regardless of what the Vikings did or whatever, lots of people in Britain, especially, I think, are very proud, aren't they? People like to talk about the Viking blood in their veins. Well, this was absolutely going on in the 19th century. It's all over the introductions to these books. You could throw a dart at one of these at random, and you would find something in the introduction where someone's saying these stories are particularly appropriate for all of us with Viking, you know, with the blood of these ancestors in our veins, and this spirit of northern fortitude and adventure, you know, is something that is a huge part of our island race. You see this all the time, and of course, something similar was happening in the US, where there was lots of people wanted to claim Viking connections as well. In fact, lots of people that, you know, as I'm sure you know, I'm sure other people have talked about as well. You know, there was a kind of lots of people wanted to claim that the Vikings, you know, were the first Europeans in on the American continent, on the North American continent, and had stayed since, you know, and I think that's a myth that's kind of been busted now. But around about that time, everyone wanted it. So yeah, you can sort of see that Vikings. You can see why Vikings are continually on the syllabus. But certainly in my childhood, which was, you know, considerably sometime before yours, but there was no real mention of the myths. We did like bits and bobs on the Vikings, absolutely, and like I say, because I come from this town which is very associated with them, but absolutely nothing. You know, it was on. If I'm being really honest, it was just something that was not. It was not a topic that I knew, that I was familiar with very much at all. So when I first started getting interested in this, which was I did a master's degree about 5 years ago in Viking studies, and one of the reasons why I did it was just because you could do it. The university that I did it with, the University of the Highlands and Islands in the UK, you were able to do most of it online, and so it was very, very useful for me at the time, because I was, you know, working at the same time. And that was really on. If I'm being really honest, I'd never looked in any detail at the stories of Thor and Odin or whatever. It just, honestly, it just wasn't something. I'd read some of the sagas at university, for example, but the myths themselves, you know, I hadn't spent much time with them. And I do think if it hadn't been for Marvel, and if it hadn't been, well, first for Marvel Comics and then for the, you know, for the movies, it probably wouldn't be quite as well known as certain other mythologies. You know, I think there's been something. There was this huge popularity, like I say, from the middle of the 19th century and up to the middle of the 20th century. Then it seems, you know, it sort of started to die down a little bit. Yes, there were people like Kevin Crossley-Holland, like you say. Yes, you know, and then Neil Gaiman's come back, yeah, but that was, you know, a long time after the first movie. I think it was 2017 or so when that book came out, but 2011 for the first Thor movie. So I think, yeah, I'm very glad, obviously, that these stories are now a bit more in the, you know, just in people's minds, and also, yeah, of course, like some of the modern day authors as well who've come and taken, taken very different turns with these stories as well, and used them as a starting point to go off and do something really imaginative. But I'm actually really glad, yeah, because just in terms of purely the stories themselves, yeah, that was something that was kind of missing when I was a kid anyway. It was definitely more the Vikings themselves, but not so much about the myths. So super glad that they're back.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating to hear you kind of like mention how, kind of like, as you mentioned, Melvin Burgess had a book that he remembers reading. I remember
Yeah.
reading or listening to Joanne Harris talk about her kind of experience in Norse. I think it was actually at the start of listening to her Loki series, well, duology, as an audio book. She had a little brief introduction where she was talking about how she got into it, and again she said it was from a book in the library that she got kind of all Matilda-esque, but it was kind of a bit too old for her, but she went for it anyway and really enjoyed it. I know Neil Gaiman's done something similar at the start of his audiobook of his retellings, because he narrates it all.
Yeah.
And I think I was interviewing another children's author, which I've just recently come across, not quite mythology-esque, but she dips in time travel with history, and she had a book on the Viking Age, MG Leonard, and she was telling me how she got really into it from the Terry Jones book, the saga of Eric the Viking, which is kind of like another kind of like, not quite a women author, but kind of like another forgotten classic style, and
Yeah.
that heroic aspect more than the mythology. For me personally, it came kind of adversely through reading historical fiction, hearing all these characters of in the Bernard Cornwall Uhtred, son of Uhtred series,
Yeah.
The Last Kingdom, hear them talking about the gods so immersively. I thought, well, I want to know more. I want to know why they think this and why they think that. And so I dove into any kind of encyclopedia of mythology I could find, and then I found all these stories. I'm thinking, these gods are crazy. They're so different to the Greek mythology, which kind of like we didn't really touch much at school, but I know it was often a staple, if not Greek or Roman mythology, kind of for a long time in various syllabuses over the centuries.
Yeah, I
So
mean, if you don't, I'll just respond to two things there in case I
go for it.
forget later. So, yes, Joanne Harris talks about has talked to probably many more as well. But yes, Gerber, she has mentioned in the past as something that
Ah,
she read, but also this a book called Thunder of the Gods by
ooh.
Dorothy Hosford, and this is yeah, pretty decent retelling, I would say. Very quite a slim volume. You can get through this in a couple of hours probably. But yeah, again, quite sort of nice illustrations. It's not it's an old library book, this one. But yes, Joanne Harris for that one, and she mentions Gerber as well, and Walt Simonson, who is the comic book author and artist who revitalized the Thor comic with his Ragnarok series, and he was so important to the history of the character with Marvel that when they made that first movie, they invited him onto the set, and he's got a role as an extra there with his wife
Oh,
in one
nice.
of the banqueting scenes. And he was another one. Yeah, he grew up looking at Gerber. I'm actually trying to get hold of Walt to see if he'd be around to give to do an interview with me, because I'd like to I've seen him reference that, but I'd like to ask him myself. But yeah, so you can see, can't you, that these retellings, this just being recycled, isn't it? It's like so many modern day authors read these children's books, and I think now, critics and so on are much more likely to take children's retellings more seriously. But that's a relatively recent thing, I think. It's like back in the day, people were just very dismissive of children's books, I think, in general, and because a lot of these were, not very well connected female writers. A lot of them were like school teachers or just amateur historians, really, or amateur mythographers, and a lot of them were, they were just like, okay, well, this is just a piece of a flimsy bit of work, but you can see the influence that they've had, and so that's a wonderful thing to see all these new authors talking about them.
It's almost such a shame that we know so little about kind of like Helen Gerber and Jenny
Yeah.
Hall and Bradish and all the other names that I mentioned, because it's, to me, it just got me curious, kind of like what made them inspired to write about Norse myths, kind of like, have they got even older stories or books, or if they just heard it in conversation in kind of like various societies, balls, because of course it's kind of like the 18th, 19th century is the age of when Wagner burst onto the stage with literally his 4-part ring cycle, of course featuring the wonderful Walkyier and Brynhilde and all that jazz that I'm into. And I know kind of like when I was researching about Brynhilde's representations from that moment, I was in literature, but from opera, from stage, then into books and everything else. Kind of like illustration obviously is a key method of going with the retelling, because of course Arthur Rackham, I want to say, kind of like illustrated a lot of artwork for kind of like narrative novelizations, I suppose, in a way, if not just written scripts to go along with this play, so they can be reach an even wider audience. So it just shows just how expansive like the ripple effect is, and how it can go from kind of like both as like readers but also as illustrators. It's truly remarkable how long this kind of like this Viking wave has been going on for. It didn't start with Marvel. I want to clarify, everyone. It did not start with Marvel.
No, I think we've established that. But yeah, we know like a tiny bit about this, or at least I think I know. So I think that going back before the Curies, I think one of the most underrated books in terms of its influence was a book called Northern Mythology, Volume 1 by Benjamin Thorpe. And that was published in 1851. And Benjamin Thorpe wrote this introduction to his quite learned book about Northern mythology. He lived in Denmark. He went to Denmark and learned enough Scandinavian and Old Norse to be able to read the Eddas in their original language. And so what he wrote this book, and within a sort of 90-page introduction at the start of this book, he goes through almost all of the main myths and just gives them a little summary. So you can read that again in half a day or something, and you've got like a decent summary of all those myths. You can't call it a retelling because it's a scholarly book and it's just in the introduction, and you know, that's the point is not to retell the stories. He just includes them all there. And I know that the Curies read Benjamin Thorpe. And also, again, I mentioned before about, you know, the wallet test and linguistic fingerprinting and so on, that you can sort of tell. I haven't done a sort of definitive systematic study of it or anything, but you can pretty much tell that the Curies, you know, used that book as their source material. Many other people did as well. Now, the interesting thing about that book is that yes, it was written by Benjamin Thorpe, but I think he had a significant amount of help from his stepdaughter. So he married a Danish widow, and the stepdaughter, I've just had to look her up again. Elisa Otte was her name. Now, if you ever get any time, Google or do a search for Elisa Otte. She lived a remarkable life. She ended up at a university in America somewhere, if I recall correctly. She was involved with Benjamin Thorpe on that project, I think, but definitely later on some of his actual translation work as well. It's unknown how much of an influence she was. We don't know exactly what she did, but again, I think it's super interesting that talk about forgotten female authors. So even going back to this 1851 book, which proved so influential, perhaps she was involved in that as well, but certainly she was involved in working on the translation projects, which she did later. So there you go. If that's not all too boring, Rebecca, like I said, I can talk about that all day. But yeah, once you go down the rabbit hole of these retellers, you never get out again.
Well, I think, as you said, kind of like it's that issue of recycling, and it's certainly a theme that I've come across in my own research, just on Valkyries in general. The issue of reinterpretation, because as kind of like some of the introductions in these wonderfully beautiful books, and I did buy them purely because they're beautiful, not just because they got the word Viking or Norse on the front. I'm a bookworm at heart. They all kind of like discuss the idea that, of course, kind of like Christianity has kind of like been locked in textually with its Testament and Old Testament and the Psalms and everything else, whereas Norse mythology hasn't been. Kind of the stories of the Vikings themselves are just so fluid and ephemeral and malleable. Kind of like, even I reckon even when they were told orally, there were probably multiple versions going around the same country, because there were probably multiple storytellers. And like every human, we know to tell a different story to a different audience. You don't tell the same story to a king that you tell to a farmer. For example, you've got a different grade of audience there, a different grade of pay. You've got to aim it at the right market. And it's still kind of, it's still fascinating that, of course, we've got Snorri's Edda and the Poetic Edda, but we don't really know where half of the things that Snorri wrote came from, and we don't know who wrote or compiled the Poetic Edda either. It's still a mystery, it's an enigma. We have words on a page and that's it. And it's so vexing, especially when I was doing my Valkyrie research. Like,
No,
it's references to poems, to stories that were no longer there. And it's like, oh yes, the next one follows this. And I'm like, well, where is it? Where is it?
No, I think that's right, and I think it's interesting that so much of it is still up for grabs. That's absolutely right. So you can take, you talked at the start about some of the authors who've taken the stories and done wildly imaginative things with them. But even if you just take the stories, so few of them are completely closed in terms of in terms of the tale itself. There's miles of room in all of these for different types of interpretation, and I honestly think that's why it's such a rewarding area to look at the different ways people have told the stories. What's their point? Because there is so much room to do interesting things. It's probably only a handful of them where you tend to get the same story told again. So there's the poem, the Eddic poem Thrymskvida, which is the story of when Thor loses his hammer and he has to go back and with Loki, and he dresses up as a woman, dresses up as the bride in order to trick yeah, exactly, Thrym to get his hammer back. And that's I would say, honestly, that's probably the story which is told the same basically in almost every retelling, because it's such a beautifully kind of compact story in the poem. It's like one of the very few that basically has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and there's your story. Everything in it is very, very easy to understand. There's still a bit of room for, embellishment and so on, but it's really noticeable that almost every book of retellings has it, and they tell it in basically the same way, because it's got so much going for it. There's so much. It's like, it's charming. You've got Loki being kind of helpful and useful, but you can add little bits in if you want to make him sound a bit more mischievous than he actually is. You've obviously got the wonderful image of Thor, this big, heroic god, dressing up as a woman as well. And you've just got a nice, and it's got a very, very defined ending, which not every story has, right? So it just has a very, straightforward, almost novelistic in a way. The other one is the other one I mentioned earlier on, Thor's trip to Utgarda-Loki as well. It's it's much longer story, but it's quite self-contained, and you can sort of tell that story, and most people do. But apart from those ones, there's so much that that is just open to interpretation. There are different versions, exactly like you said, and so writers have had a lot of fun with it. One of the interesting things actually about the Neil Gaiman book is actually quite how conventional a set of stories it is. It's a very, he picks more or less the same stories that. It's right in the middle in terms of which stories he chooses. You could look at a 19th century book of retellings and you would see he's chosen exactly the same, pretty much, as a couple of other authors. And the way he tells them, there isn't really much in there, that's different from the way anyone else would do. And what does that tell you? I don't know. It tells you that either that Neil Gaiman was playing it safe, or that the stories themselves have been like pretty out there, ever since they were being retold. Probably a little bit of both, actually. When I was reading I recently reread the Neil Gaiman book of retellings, and he kind of gets going when he gets into some of the violence, some of the awful punishment of Loki towards the end. He seems to be enjoying himself a little bit, but a lot of the other writing, I mean, it's obviously very well told, but it's. I don't know, really. There's something, like I say, something so orthodox about it, so conventional about the way he tells the stories. I think that it was a surprise for me, anyway.
I know when I got the kind of like the illustrated edition through, because I've also got the hardback when it first came out, and then I got the illustrated version. I did actually try reading. I think it was it the Lay of Thrym? Yeah, it was. It was the Lay of Thrym one to my then 4-and-a-bit-year-old daughter, and bless her, she kind of like looking at the pictures, and she kind of like zoned out halfway through. I did try and put voices on for her, but I think, as you say, there is that kind of, as well as the aspect of interpretation and the broader retelling, there's the also, as you say, the echo repetition almost. As you say, like they follow the same structure, there'll be the same characters, the same narrative events, they might happen at a slightly different pace, there might be the odd description. Frey might be more scary, she might be more timid, who knows? I mean, I'll always enjoy kind of like Neil Gaiman's description of her, kind of like her anger shaking the house and all the cats hiding when Loki comes to ask for a feathered cloak.
Yeah.
Yes, that's the impression every woman should give to a man, I think, personally. But I lost track of what I was saying. Yeah, I'm wondering if in some ways these modern writers are trying to write the stories echoing what they remembered reading and enjoying. Certainly thinking back to how you brought about that other author from the past that had influence from his daughter. I know what Joanne Harris, her Loki series, I think it began just as bedtime stories to her daughter Anushka, and then she decided to write it down. And certainly with Terry Jones's heroic, not quite a retelling, but an original, I would say, kind of like the saga of Eric the Viking. He wrote that purely for his son because he wrote fairy tales for his daughter when she was born, so he had to equal the balance somehow. And of course, the Great Viking Exhibition was out just before he started writing his story, so that's another element of influence and peak of Viking interest.
Yeah,
so
I think there's definitely something of that, and I think one of the nice things about the Neil Gaiman version is that he says, I think in the introduction, he encourages people to retell the tales themselves, and I really like that. Right, so I agree. I think they're just stories that you can tell. Like I've tried a little bit as well. You can tell them in a literary way, or you can tell them in a just tell people the stories. They're really good if you can just get the facts straight, because like I say, with some of them it can be quite hard to remember all the little details of what's going on, or even that some of them are so strange, and I think it's Jackson Crawford who talks about the kind of dream logic of the Eddas, that you can't really expect one thing to follow another for a very logical reason. So in terms of novelizing them or telling them in that traditional way, you have to there's a lot of gaps to fill in if you want to do that, and Neil Gaiman has done that in his version. But there's something nice, I think, about just retelling them as they are as well. Despite the inconsistencies, despite the strangeness of them, sometimes it's just good to tell stories even if they don't make the kind of sense that we kind of have trained ourselves to expect. We expect something to happen. There's good psychological reasons why a certain character should behave in that way. Logical leaps should be evident, rather than these rather strange things that happen which are sometimes contradictory and so on. So I'll give you one more example, and I'm not suggesting he did this consciously or anything like that, but I mentioned before that Neil Gaiman says that one of the retellings he read when he was a kid was by Roger Lancelin Green. So again, in that story of Thor's trip to Utgard the Loki, at the very start, they go to the house of a peasant's house, basically, and to lodge for the night. And in order to have something to eat, Thor kills and skins the goats who were driving his chariot. And he says to the family, he says to everyone, eat all you like, but put the bones back on the skin, I think it is. And the next morning, he takes his hammer and blesses, or whatever exactly he does, and revives the goats. But one of them is lame in the hind leg. And that's because Thialfi, the young boy, has taken the bone to get at the marrow. And okay, what Neil Gaiman says in his book is that this is because Loki has whispered to Thialfi, saying, the marrow is the best bit, and Thor just wants it for himself, so why don't you take it? And okay, if you look in one of the edit poems, there's the tiniest hint that Loki may have had something to do with it, but it does not say that in Snorri, right? It does not say that this happened. And I imagine Neil Gaiman saw that and thought, well, I need a logical leap. I've got my mischievous character there. I've got someone who kind of breaks a rule, and we don't really know why he did it. So he's put two and two together and come up with this detail. So I'm sure Neil Gaiman sort of thought he was being quite smart doing that. But it's actually, there's a long tradition of people making that up as well. So you can trace this back too. So it's in Lancelin Green's retelling, which Neil Gaiman read when he was a kid, but did not reread as he was preparing to write his own stuff. And the point I'm just trying to make there is that I think these early retellings obviously leave a bit of a mark on you, so I think without going back and doing anything consciously, I think he's picked that up and just it's something that's lodged in the back of his brain. And I think it's just a good sign of a good storyteller and a great story. If something that you've read as a kid is probably just like lodged in the back. It wasn't Roger Lancelin Green who came up with it either, by the way. You can trace that back all the way to yet another forgotten female author, M.W. McDowell, who did a kind of not a translation but an adaptation of a book by a German author, came out in about 1881, and that's the book, I think it's called Asgard and the Gods. That's the book that's mentioned in A.S. Byatt's Ragnarok, the end of the gods.
Yes.
That's the book that she has. It almost plays a role in it. So the very, very first reference I can find to it is in the original German version of that book. So that just goes to show that little detail, that invented detail of this was mischievous Loki who whispered in the ear of Thialfi, goes all the way back to something like 1847. Again, completely made up date, Rebecca, but it was probably somewhere near there. And has gone all the way through, got through like a sort of like in a weird and wonderful way, has made it all the way through to Neil Gaiman, and I'm sure millions more people have now read that book or come across it in the comics, or I think there's a radio dramatization. I think you mentioned the audio book earlier on. So untold numbers of people, have heard that version of it. So that will now probably become the standard version of that story. So keep an eye out in the future for other authors or adapters of all kinds, maybe in games now, maybe in whatever the AI future holds for us, kind of including that detail, and then you'll see it and you'll think that you'll wonder where that came from, and now we'll know to go all the way back to Wilhelm Wegener via lots of forgotten authors.
That's a remarkable thing. It's certainly, as you say, kind of these little details that kind of like are echoed and repeated in one guise or another through all these different retellings from the past to the present. It certainly makes me think of, going slightly off Norse stuff, kind of like, of course, kind of like classic fairy tales, of course, Disney, which is now Marvel. They're both they're both giants locked to the hip, basically. Kind of like Disney retold so many of the fairy tales just in their films, but of course before then there was kind of like Grimm's fairy tales, but of course lots of other fairy tale books. Of course, like my daughter, she has several pop-up books and collections of fairy tales, and it has been only kind of like talking to people like yourself and kind of like a storyteller who does Norse stories, kind of like in the oral tradition, all of these kind of like original takes on them. Jason book made me realise that actually kind of like there's 3 different ways that Snow White falls into a coma. Kind of like either she swallows the poisoned apple, or she's got it stuck in her throat, or kind of like she just falls asleep, kind of thing. Because of course my daughter's familiar with what happens to the Little Mermaid in the Little Mermaid film, but in her fairy tale book, the Little Mermaid doesn't have a happy ending, and the prince goes off with the other princess, and she returns to the sea very heartbroken and upset. And I had to explain to her, it's just the way people retell stories. Walt Disney, who decided to turn it into a film, decided he was going to have the ending, and that was it. So that's all I can explain to her. But it's definitely, as you say, kind of like definitely identifiable with the Norse stories as well.
Yeah, completely. And I guess that's again, we don't know all that much about this, but yes, so many competing versions of these things. Who's to and that's the only thing that kind of, the only times I get annoyed at anything really about bringing it back to the Marvel movies is I get slightly annoyed sometimes when people say, "Oh, Marvel got this wrong." That they got, because we don't have access to the originals. I think you said right at the start, the versions that we do have were written down literally hundreds of years, maybe even, maybe you could say thousands of years, who knows, but literally hundreds of years after these stories were circulating, in some form anyway. I think I was reading something, Stephen Pollington's book, I think, on Odin, and I think he makes the point that the Sutton Hoo burial mask contains some detailing which might be a reference to the Mead of Poetry story, and I can't remember when the mask is dated to, but I don't know, 400 and something possibly. I don't know. So you really are looking at closer to 1,000 years. When from when we have them written down, and so we don't know what's original. We don't know what color hair or color beard Thor may have had. And in any case, we can probably all agree that they're stories rather than any kind of literal truth. So it doesn't kind of matter anyway. But yes, I do. If you do a Google search for what Marvel got wrong about the myths, you will uncover like dozens and dozens of these stories, this sort of clickbaity type stuff on the internet. But like who the hell cares? Because like I say, what's original anyway. So that's the only thing that slightly annoys me when I see that. Because yes, you're absolutely right. What you said, there would have been multiple versions of these things. I actually think the Grimm, someone else will be able to tell this, or you perhaps but the Grimm's Book of Fairy Tales, I think they changed quite a lot of those from edition to edition as well. So I think when that project started out, if I remember at all correctly, it was absolutely to kind of get down the earliest and purest, if you like, version that they could get down. But I have a feeling that they were edited, and by the time you got to the sort of 5th edition or later of Grimm's Fairy Tales, I think there's been quite a lot of editorializing on that. So even like the versions that we see in Grimm, depending on what version you have, it's probably very different to the versions that they were being told by the nursemaids and the spinning women who they actually spoke to or were very happy to speak to get the earliest versions of these tales. So yeah, and of course there would have been generations and hundreds of years variations of those. Well, it's a fascinating topic. I wish I knew more about it. I think if I had more time, I'd be starting to look in that direction as well, just myths and fairy tales and stories just in general, because obviously everyone has them, right? There's wonderful stories like that all over the place in every community.
Yeah, you're quite right. There is a plethora of kind of like stuff on from YouTube to blogs to website articles to full-blown research, kind of like, 'cause I know you yourself have done some, kind of like analysing what Marvel do and why they do it, not necessarily declaring that they're wrong, but just asking why. I certainly would love to do more on all the many authors I've read that have done Valkyries in their books, kind of like, why has some got wings and why some not? Why do they each collect the dead that become undead in different ways and different manners? But I certainly kind of like, because there's even so little about Valkyries, even in Snorri's text, kind of like there's a passing reference. We don't really know how or why they were trained, what they did. Were they goddesses? Were they demigoddesses? Were they just spirits? They're linked often to the Nadir. There's lots of whys and what ifs and maybes. And I certainly don't think that when like all the Disney films came out, there was a huge outcry of people saying, no, you've got it all wrong. Grimm had it right. Why is Cinderella not dancing like her mum to death on hot coals somewhere at the end? And certainly in terms of editing, especially if these books were being published, as Grimm's obviously was, as all these retellings that we're talking about, the publishers would have been aware that if we kept like lots of the gory stuff in, people might not buy it.
Yeah.
It just might be as simple as that, kind of like, and I suppose that's what Marvel certainly have done with their version or their depiction representation of like the Norse gods and all the antics of Thor and Loki and Odin. They've certainly kind of tamed them down, but they've obviously kind of like made it in such a way that it still attracts an audience, and it's got the cult icon following that they all have now, with Thor and Loki being the most popular Norse gods you can think of today.
Yeah, I really like what you said there, because I think that's always been going on, hasn't it? We like to sort of look at things like Disney and say to ourselves, well, of course, they just take commercial, things into account, and that's why they've done that. Sure, but authors have always done that, and I think we were sort of edging towards that when we were talking earlier on, weren't we? Publishers always know what's going to sell and what's not going to sell, or think they know anyway, and will nudge authors in a certain direction, of course, and Yeah, to take any retailer, I'm sure they're all thinking about what they're allowed to get away with, how far they can go, and so on. So it's not unique to 21st century blockbuster filmmaking in any way. I'm sure this has been going on. If you think someone sitting around a hearth telling this story, or in a hall, uh, in the Viking Age, is going to, like you say, is going to moderate the story depending on who the audience is. So I'm sure, there were different versions, depending on how many kids. Well, perhaps, I mean, this is me projecting backwards, but maybe there were, versions which were more acceptable to tell, in different company as well. So yeah, absolutely no different.
Mm. Well, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you about all of this, and I know I would love to get you back in the future when I can reopen the hall after my mini Viking has arrived and invaded my life, and literally taken over. Quite literally, to talk about kind of like your kind of like your deeper dive, of course, into the Marvel aspect of things. But it's been fascinating touching base with you on the foundation of that research, which is all these classic retellings. And as you say, the fact that they are now being reprinted again, like the Helen Gerber edition is the very fancy Barnes and Noble edition. The two books that I've got, by Jenny Hall, and the collection one, they're both by publisher Arcturus with a bear on the front. And again, they make them incredibly look Nordic, and like the gelling style, and the kind of even the covers are the appeal now, because so much children's illustration it's not always as good as it was way back when these retellings were first told. I do think. I mean, there are some fantastic illustrators out there, don't get me wrong, but there's definitely been a shift in the way illustration is done. If I can see from my daughter's bookshelf, there's some really basic 2D illustration, but then some gorgeous ones. But thank you so much. It's been an absolutely wonderful trip down this rabbit hole with you. So thank you.
No, absolute pleasure. It's been really nice to be here. And yeah, maybe there's a new Marvel movie out at the end of the year where Thor and Loki are both going to be in it. So maybe early next year, maybe we could resume our conversation, and we can find out what happens to the remaining Norse gods in this next Marvel movie.
Yeah, so this isn't the Doomsday one that's
Doomsday. Yeah, so we know that Thor's been in the trailer, so we know, but
yes.
Tom Hiddleston's in it as well. We know, so we'll see what happens. I think it's going to be something to do with their children. So I don't know if you remember, but from Thor: Love and Thunder, then Thor has, is now the stepfather to a child, and the others are fathers as well. So there's Steve Rogers and can't remember well. Yeah, I don't know who else, but yes, Reed Richards from the Fantastic Four and Sue, is it as well? Yeah, their parents as well. So I think it's going to be something to do with the children. But yes, be interesting to see what happens.
Tony Stark had a daughter as well when he finally
did. Yeah, so yeah, whether Pepper will be back with the daughter as well. But yeah, we're going to see Robert Downey Jr. in his new role, aren't we? So that'll be fun.
Yeah, I mean, it was thanks to you that I actually finally started watching the Loki series, because I know you talked about that at Stavanger, and I'd heard all about it. Well, heard lots of things about it, but never actually found time to watch it. And I did after I got back from Stavanger, and I binged both series within 2 weeks, and I really, really loved it. I really loved it. It was incredible storytelling, and of course, Tom Hiddleston is just an amazing actor. I just love him to bits.
You could watch him in anything, basically, couldn't you?
But yeah, that I mean, what he's done for the role of Loki, and how they explore Loki in that series, is another episode that I would love to get you back on, just because that also has a very strong aspect of storytelling, strangely enough, especially in season 2. I'll try not to spoil it, but if you haven't watched it, go watch it. It's been out for a few years now. But thank you so much again for joining me in Valhalla, and I wish you best of luck with your research, and we will definitely have you on again soon.
Wonderful. Looking forward to speaking again. Cheers, Rebecca. Okay, bye-bye.